let me introduce the second speaker, and like the Monty Python will say, now for something completely different. So Dr. Sandra Wachter is a lawyer and research fellow at the Data and Ethics, AI and Robotics and Internet Regulation Cybersecurity at the University of Oxford and an Alan Institute, the Alan Turing Institute in London. She's also in the law committee of IEEE, and she works as policy advisor in government and NGOs. In regulatory and ethical questions concerning emerging technologies. Sandra's research focuses on legal and ethical implications of big data, AI and robotics, as well as government surveillance, predictive policing, and human rights online. And she's going to give a talk today about counterfactual explanation for GDPR. Okay.
Thank you. Is this working? Hi. Thanks so much for the introduction. And yes, so this talk is probably going to be different than most of the talks that have been here during this conference. So as I said, I'm a lawyer. So I'm going to be talking about a legal framework and what that means for the machine learning community. And the question of fairness and transparency and accountability from a legal lens. And I'm going to be focusing on a framework that is coming into force on May 25th, and that's the GDPR. For those of you who have not heard about that, it's the new legal framework in Europe that will regulate the use and the evaluation of personal data. So it's basically regulating the relationship between the data subject, so an individual, and companies, a data controller, and gives a new harmonized standard in Europe for all the member states in the European Union. But interestingly enough, it's not just applicable within the European Union, it's also going to be applicable outside the European Union. For example, if you have data transfers, or if a company, for example in the US, wants to target the European market, they will have to adhere to the new rules that the framework will bring. There is a lot of panic around this framework at the moment, and everybody is freaking out, which is, from a legal perspective, kind of amusing, because if you're really honest, and you compare the new framework to the framework that we still have in place, which is the European Data Protection Directive, the framework hasn't actually quite changed that much. It's basically the same stuff. The only difference is that we now have very high fines attached to it. So I guess this is where the panic comes from. So if I want to be cynical, I'd say people are freaking out because they have been breaching data protection laws for 20 years now, and now it's going to get serious. So yes, I guess this is changing, and I think a lot of companies, and also the public sector, are trying to figure out what that framework actually means and what needs to be done to be compliant with the law. A couple of things here before we start off with the transparency stuff is let's talk about the guiding principles of the GDPR. So those are not new either, but they are now very hard enforceable, and the fines are up to 4% of the annual turnover, which is a lot. So that could also hurt like big companies, not just SMEs and stuff. So we have 7 guiding principles here that are somehow reflected in the framework, sometimes with a definition, sometimes not, but it gives you the intention of what the regulator wanted to do when it comes to the use of personal data. So the first principle is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. I mean, we talked about fairness yesterday. There is no clear definition of what fairness actually means, and I can tell you the lawyers don't have an idea either. So you have to be fair when you evaluate data, when you collect data, but what fairness means is not defined. Lawfulness makes sense. Of course, you have to follow the law. It's interesting that you need to put that actually in the law. Please follow the law that we just drafted for you. So good to know. The other thing is transparency. Transparency basically reflects the idea that you should really be open and honest of what you're doing with the data that you're collecting. And then a couple of other principles that are very typical for European data protection law. The first is purpose limitation. That means when you collect the data, you have to have a very clear understanding of what the purpose is. You need to know what is the aim of the data collection. So you have to have that in mind. If you don't have that, you're not allowed to collect data. The principle of data minimization means only collect data, that data that is necessary, as little as possible. So this is interesting in the age of big data, where we want to collect all the data that we can get hands on, where data protection law says, well, actually, only collect the necessary data and nothing that goes beyond that. Another principle is accuracy. That means the data controllers, so companies in the public sector, have now a legal obligation to make sure that the data is accurate, complete, and up to date all the time. That's going to be fun. The other thing is storage limitation. So in addition to the fact that you will need to know what purpose you're pursuing and the fact that you're only allowed to collect data, little amounts of data, you should also delete them as soon as you don't need it anymore. Also interesting when you think about the age of big data. The other thing is integrity and confidentiality. This leads back to cybersecurity hygiene, that you have a legal obligation to make sure that your system can't be compromised. The interesting thing there is this is legally binding, but there are no standards of what constitutes a good cybersecurity system. So this will very much be defined by future jurisprudence, and we don't know what that means yet. But again, you have an obligation to make sure that your system is safe, or as safe as possible. And then the last principle is accountability. Accountability means that you should demonstrate that you're compliant with the law. You should demonstrate that you're using privacy by design, privacy by default tools. Again, no definition of what privacy by design means. So this is going to be interesting too. So if you look at the principles in general, right, they look very appealing and it makes sense, but if you actually look at it a bit closer, there's so much ambiguity and there's no real guidance on how to implement this. But this is just about the actual usage of the data. When it comes to machine learning and AI, there has been, or there is still, a very persistent rumor that basically says that GDPR will also guarantee individuals a right to explanation. So the idea would be an algorithm is making a decision about you, and afterwards you can ask for an explanation. And there was a massive outcry about that. People have been, claiming Europe is going to ban machine learning, and it's going to be outruled, and AI is going to be forbidden in Europe, and all of that. I think that was very problematic, and there's still this idea flying around that you will actually need to explain what the algorithm is doing. And we felt the need to actually say something about that, and wrote a paper why right to explanation does not exist in the GDPR, because we felt like we need to redefine the discussion here and actually look a bit deeper of what is actually required by the legally binding text as of May 25th. I'm not going to get into the details here. If people are interested, they can look it up. It's publicly available. The only thing that I need for the further talk is to talk to you about what explanation mean in terms of what the framework is defining. So in that paper, we came up with a framework that is implicit or explicit in the GDPR itself. So the types of explanation that are implicit there is you can either explain the system, which you can do either before a decision has been made or after a decision has been made, so ex post or ex ante. Or you can explain somebody the rationale behind an individual decision, which obviously you can only do after the decision has been made. So this is like what the law somehow points at. And the thing is that is actually legally required as of May is that you don't have a right to explanation to know anything about the rationale about an individual decision, but you have something that could be called a right to be informed about the existence of automated processes. That means I have to inform you that I'm planning on using an algorithm for a decision for a specific purpose, and I have to give you some information about how the system works, but only, and that's also very important, if the system is solely automated. That means if there is no human decision-making loop, and only if the decision affects the individual in a legal or significant way. So this is also very limited, and there has been a lot of discussion around this at the moment, what that actually means and what needs to be explained. And if you look at the literature, and if you look at what policy reports are saying, and if you talk to legislators in general, there is very much resistance to make explanations legally binding. And the question is, why is there so much resistance, and why is there so much hesitance to actually make explanation enforceable? As I said, we don't think it's actually legally binding, and even if they were legally binding, they would only be applicable in very limited cases if the process is automated, solely automated, or has significant effects. The other thing, and that's very important here, is explanation could infringe on trade secrets, intellectual property rights, or possible on the privacy rights of other people. If you give too much information about the system, if you give them the whole algorithm, you could reverse engineer, find out personal information about other people from the training data set, and obviously trade secrets, that's a huge barrier that always comes up. Explanations are also sometimes technically unfeasible. So this is another barrier where people are very hesitant to actually argue or champion for explanations. And the other thing is, even if you are able to explain a system, it might not be very meaningful for an individual. If I apply for a loan and you give me the source code afterwards, it's probably not the thing that I'm actually interested in, not the thing that I'm looking for, and I might not be able to understand it anyway. And the last thing is, yes, if you have too much transparency, you could start manipulating or gaming the system. And I think all those reasons are very valid, have to be taken seriously, and kind of pose the question, so are we done with this? Like, it's hard. It infringes on trade secrets. You could manipulate the system. The question is this ethical? And this is where it gets interesting. Just because something is hard and something is, problematic at the moment, should we just, be done with it and move on? And we thought, well, actually, no. I think it's still very important to think about explanations. And this is why we wrote another paper, which was follow-up work on the first paper, which is counterfactual explanations without opening the black box, automated decisions under GDPR, which is now forthcoming in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. It's also available on SSR and an archive for if anybody wants to have a closer look at this. And that paper was actually quite interesting because I wrote it with two other colleagues. One is Brent Mittelstadt, who is an ethicist, and Chris Russell, who is a machine learning expert. So we had 3 different disciplines thinking about that topic and tried to come up with something that is feasible and tries to serve all the purposes and can, mitigate the tensions that we see with explanations at the moment. So what we did there is try to have a different approach of explanation and actually think the other way around. Not should you have an explanation or should you not have an explanation, but more like why do you want an explanation in the first place and work from there. So we looked at it from an ethical perspective, a philosophical perspective. What do we mean by explanations? Why do you want an explanation in the first place? And we came up with 3 different kinds of explanation that could be interesting. And we looked at it from the perspective of the data subject, so the end user, the patient, the loan applicant, the person that has to go to prison. What is it that you actually want to know if an algorithm is making a decision about you? First, you might want to understand the decision. You want to know why you didn't get the loan, why you didn't get the job. You might want to have enough information to possibly challenge a decision. If you think that the decision is unlawful or inaccurate or discriminatory, or you might want to have enough information to alter future decisions, because it could be true that you apply for a job, and you didn't get the job because your grades weren't bad, or reference letter was bad, or your CV had typos, which are all valid reasons not to give you the job, but to give you some indication of what needs to change in the future to get that result. This information could be very helpful. So these were the 3 goals of explanation that we thought of. And then we thought, okay, what's technically feasible? What could we actually do? And we thought about the idea of using counterfactuals explanations. So counterfactuals describe the dependency on the external facts that lead to a decision, and this is how we define counterfactual explanations. So score P was returned because variable V had the values V1, V2 associated with them. If V had instead the values V1 prime, V2 prime, the score P would have returned. So if you lay this back on an actual case, if you apply for a loan, for example, a counterfactual explanation would mean you were denied the loan because your income was £30,000. If it had been £45,000, we would have offered you the loan. So that's the idea of a counterfactual explanation. So what that means basically is you are here at 0, and I'm going to tell you what needs to change from get to 0 to 2 where you actually get the loan. I'm not going to explain to you the algorithm and the internal logic. I'm just going to give you indications of what needs to change to get from A to B. So what that means is we use the L1 norm to induce sparsity and basically expand this to see what needs to change to get from the red dot to hit the decision boundary. and generate an counterfactual. So here would be the first counterfactual that would return you some values. You could generate multiple counterfactuals, so there would be one here, but you could have another one here. And then you could offer multiple counterfactuals to the individual. The interesting thing here is that counterfactuals would actually have a lot of advantages. So the idea is I'm going to tell you the smallest possible change to the current decision model that needs to happen to get you from where you are for where you want to be. As I said, you could offer multiple counterfactuals, not just one, and then give people the option of what counterfactual is the most suitable for them. The interesting thing is you don't need to understand the internal logic of the algorithm to do that, which is one of the main barriers when it comes to counterfactual in general, because people say, well, we actually don't know what's happening in the algorithm, therefore counterfactuals are useless. They can be used in very complex systems like neural nets, so that's another argument that usually comes up. It's too complicated, we can't explain that. With counterfactuals, you could do something. And the last one is the trade secrets argument. If I only give you limited information and not the full source code, it's less likely to infringe on trade secrets, intellectual property rights, and the rights of freedoms of others. So this was the idea, and then we tried to look at the GDPR and look how counterfactuals would actually fit in that framework, whether it's satisfying what GDPR wants, or if it's even doing something better. So the first aim that we looked is understanding decisions. So this is our first aim, and we looked at the framework and tried to figure out, does the GDPR actually help you to understand algorithmic decisions? So the first thing that we looked at is this very famous Recital 71 that tells you if an algorithm is making a decision that is solely automated and has significant effects, you're going to have additional safeguards. And one of them is this receive an explanation after such assessment. It's in a recital. That means it's not legally binding. In fact, during the drafting of the GDPR, the European Parliament proposed to make the right to explanation legally binding, which was not adopted in the end. So it's more like something you can do if you want to, but you're not going to be fined if you don't do it, because it's not in the legally binding text. The other thing that is very important here, explanation is not further defined. It doesn't really tell you what you need to explain. Do you need to explain the system? Do you need to explain the individual decision? Do you need to justify it? There's nothing in the framework that indicates what explanation would actually mean and whether this means to understand the algorithm or not. And it's the only section in GDPR where explanation is actually mentioned. In the meantime, the Article 29 Working Party has issued guidelines. So the Article 29 Working Party is Europe's official body that has representatives from all data protection agencies around Europe that come together and give recommendations on how to interpret the law. And it's one of the most important sources if you want to understand what you actually need to do. So and they came out with guidelines recently and actually cite both our papers already as an idea of a good method to do that. And what they say here about explanation is quite interesting, is they very much separate legally binding safeguards like human intervention or expressing your views or contesting the decision very much from the explanation, which is very highlighted to be something separate and not enforceable. And in fact, they don't even recommend it anymore. So I'm not quite sure if the Article 29 Working Party is so keen on explanations either. The other thing that might be interesting is what also could help you to understand decisions is the notification duty. So this is very interesting because at the time when you collect data, you will need to tell the individual a bunch of things. You will need to tell them about the purpose, you will need to give them contact details, you would need to inform them about your rights, and amongst other things, you would also need to tell them about the existence, as I said, of automated processing, inform them that you're going to use this to make a decision, but also give them meaningful information about the logic involved, significance, and envisioned consequences. And there's a lot of discussion around whether logic involved could mean a right to explanation. The problem is that people who claim this haven't looked at the law too closely, because the law actually tells you what you need to explain and how in-depth this explanation would need to be. Because you have here Article 12. in the GDPR that tells you that all the information in Article 13 and 14, so that it contains the logic involved bit, has to be conveyed in a very concise, transparent, and easily accessible form, very short and concise. You would need to tell the individual a meaningful overview, not an in-depth explanation of an algorithm, a meaningful overview of intended processing, future-orientated, ex ante. Just give them something that you're going to do with that. And also very interesting is this information, about future intended processing purposes, you can convey with icons. And that's interesting. So if you think logic involved would actually mean disclosing the algorithms, I have to disappoint you, because what that would mean is, because it says here you can use icons to do that. And if you're interested what meaningful information about the logic could mean, it could look like something like this. Ta-da! So that's interesting too, because during the trilogue negotiation, the European Parliament actually proposed that all the notification rules, so all the information, all the stuff that usually is on privacy notices and stuff like that, can be conveyed using icons. And the idea was, because nobody's going to read thousands of pages of privacy notices, give people something that they can grasp and quickly understand. And they came up with a couple of icons here. So I have an icon, a very short text, so you know immediately what's going to happen to your data. This was one of the proposals, which was not adopted in the end. But if you look at Article 12.8, it says that the European Commission is now tasked to develop standardized icons for all of Europe. So there's a very high chance that those things are the meaningful information about the logic that you're going to get. So very far away from an actual explanation of how the decision was made. It's also interesting that the Article 29 Working Party also looked at what logic involved could actually mean. And they are very much in favor of what I said, because it says that information about the logic involved does not mean necessarily a complex explanation or disclosure of the algorithm. Yeah? They make it very clear they don't want to ban machine learning. So this is very important to know. And they give some kind of indication of what logic involved could actually mean. And they say here, it's important to give them the main characteristics, the source, where you got the data from, and information why this is relevant. So this is very limited and very, I guess, easy to do. The other thing is that they make it very clear that this information is about future processing, because it says here, significance and consequences means that this is about intended and future processing. You give this information before you actually make a decision, and you can do that by updating your privacy notices, basically. So that's interesting, and they actually made it very clear that here, that the information duties are not a right to explanation. I think it doesn't get any clearer than that, because Article 15 is the same information that I just talked to you about the logic involved. Article 13, 14, and 15 do not differ in their content, but it is about intended processing and not an explanation of a particular decision. Yes, so the framework won't really help you to understand what's happening in the decision-making process. The next thing that I want to look at is, what about, and here counterfactuals could actually help. If you think about the idea that I just presented to you, your income was £35,000. If it had been £45,000, you've been offered the loan. This could actually be better, meeting and exceeding what the GDPR currently wants, because this information is very easy to understand. As I told you, GDPR wants very easy, digestible information. That would be a very easy statement to say. As I told you, logic involved is probably not the thing that people were hoping it would be. But if I tell you income played a role in making the decision, that could actually be very helpful. And as I said, it's less likely to infringe on trade secrets and intellectual property rights, which are also protected in the GDPR, because those things need to be counterbalanced as well. So that's a good step forward. The second goal that I said I want to talk about is challenge the decision. So the idea is, what does GDPR do in terms of helping you to challenge a decision? And that's good, because you're going to have a legally binding right to contest decisions if they are solely automated or have significant effects. You also have the right to obtain human intervention, so to talk to somebody who has a pulse, and you have the right to express your views. So those safeguards you're going to have. As I told you, there's nothing that indicates that the explanation is a precondition to contesting the decision. There's arguments around that this could be true. I think if an explanation was essential to contesting a decision, you would make it legally binding and not just put it in a recital on purpose. But this is not the only indication in the framework that we looked at, because we're also interested, maybe there are other bits and pieces that give you some kind of information that could potentially help you to contest decisions. And here is a very interesting one, which is Article 12.2, that says just in general that data controllers or company, public sector, should help the data subject to exercise their rights. The rights in Article 15 to 22. 22.3 is the right to contest. So that means, okay, maybe data controllers need to give you additional information to help you contest decisions. So I looked a bit deeper in what legal commentary has to say about that, and helping you to contest a decision or exercising your rights is there's a very low threshold for that. Helping you exercise your rights means, first and foremost, tell you about your rights. You need to be informed about your rights. You need to give them contact details, for example, to lodge a complaint. You need to build a good infrastructure to deal with those complaints. You have to make sure that there are no bureaucratic hurdles. And you need to, deal with the inquiries in a promptly manner. But the most important thing, you don't have a legal obligation to legal consultancy. You don't need to help the individual build their case. So you actually don't have very much obligation to give them information to contest the decision. The other thing, and that's interesting, because if you think that the most important thing of helping people exercise their rights is to inform them about your rights. That would mean, well, I probably have to tell you about your right to contest decisions. That would make sense. It would. But you actually don't need to do that. This is another very big loophole in there, because you don't need to inform them about your right to contest, because you only need to inform them about Article 22.1 and 4. Article 22.3 is the right to contest. So that's another big loophole there. Well, I'm not quite sure why it's there. But this just shows that actually GDPR doesn't really help you contest decisions in the first place. So counterfactuals might be better in here too. The other thing that might help you to contest decisions is that there's a general legal obligation to give you, that you should give information to ensure fair and transparent processing. Again, fair and transparent processing. No definition what that means whatsoever. And again, it's in a recital, which means it's not legally binding. And again, this was something that was proposed during the trilogue negotiations. The Parliament proposed to make this legally binding. It was not adopted in the end. So you could give them more information, but you don't have to. And this is problematic because you have a right to contest, but you actually don't get much information about the decision. So that's kind of problematic if you want to successfully contest the decision. You could be very smart and combine two rights that you have and build a bridge there, but it's going to be very exhausting, because you could also just use your right of access and your right to rectification. I can use my right of access to go to any data controller and ask them, what kind of data do you hold about me? Tell me all the data that you have. And then I can use my right of rectification and say, well, you're holding wrong data about me, or you hold incomplete data about me. Please rectify this. So in practice, this could be very problematic, because how many data points does a data controller hold about you? You would need to go through all of them, make sure that they're actually correct. You don't know if they used all the data to make the decision or just some. You wouldn't know whether the data was relevant for the decision-making process or not. So it's just, it's a Hail Mary stunt, basically. And it's going to be a lot of work. So I guess counterfactuals in that regard could be better and actually help you contest decisions, because if I know that income played a role, and I can come back and say, well, actually my income is higher, please revisit this decision, this could actually be more effective than what the framework currently does. And it's much better than I said, than Article 15 and 16, the right of access and notification, because it shows you the key variables. The counterfactual tells you the most important points that were relevant for making this decision. So it's actually serving the purpose, but it's doing more than the law actually requires you to do. And the last point is alter future decisions. As I said, it might just be the decision was fair and accurate and unbiased, but you just weren't good enough to be admitted to university or didn't get the job for valid reasons. But you might want to have some guideline to understand what needs to change. The framework doesn't really have anything in there, so this is something that the law didn't consider, but we always felt that this is something intuitively people might want to have. So in that regard, counterfactuals would actually do more than the law currently requires you to do. So yes, I believe that counterfactuals could very much help you to understand the decision much better than the law currently does. It would help you to challenge decisions if you think that the data that is used is incorrect, or the decision is unlawful for other reasons, or you have some indication of what needs to change in the future. So this is the idea here. Of course, there are limitations there, and those need to be addressed. So we have the general limitation that counterfactuals don't solve interpretability, obviously. We're not explaining the system. We don't solve the why question. We don't have an answer for that. We don't know why something is happening in the decision-making process. And from a legal and ethical perspective, this is still problematic. If you're using highly complex systems that are not interpretable, it begs the question of what kind of safeguards we need to put in place to make sure that this is actually in accordance with the law. The second point is the fairness question is not solved, because it's not going to tell you whether or not the overall system is discriminatory. However, it could give you some good of indication that inappropriate variables have been used. So a counterfactual explanation could be you didn't get the loan because you were black. So you would at least know that race played a role in making this decision and possibly contest it based on that. It doesn't mean that this attribute was used in an unlawful way, but at least it would give you some indication that something might be wrong with the actual decision. And the last thing is, yes, if you have fast-changing models, then you cannot guarantee that if you run the algorithm again, it's going to give you the same result. However, there are a lot of models, for example, in high-risk areas where laws probably will prohibit that you use fast-changing models. And even if you can give some good indication of what needs to change, you still understand what happened, and you still could possibly contest the decision. So this is from the technical limitation. From the ethical side, I think there's another thing that is something that we need to address as a society together, and this is the general question of whether or not automation is actually ethical, and whether we should automate everything, and in what kind of sectors should we use algorithms. So the question, we talked about this yesterday, is are we more or less shifting more responsibility to an artificial agent? Are we doing that? On the other hand, you could also say, well, if an algorithm is much better than a human, maybe there's a legal or ethical obligation to use an algorithm rather than a human. We had this, for example, with autonomous cars. If an autonomous car is actually much better, should we ban human drivers? And the general question of, what's the society that we want to live in? Where do we want algorithms, and where do we want humans making those decisions? And this is an ethical question that is still up for debate. But closing by saying, the idea that we had is something that satisfies competing interests, something that gives people a better understanding of what's happening when an important decision is being made about them, without stifling innovation, and without being too burdensome on data controllers, and without revealing too many aspects of an algorithm that could potentially infringe trade secrets or intellectual property rights, but still give them something that actually makes them trust that system more, or makes them better understand of what actually happened there, and potentially contest the decision if they think that the process was unlawful. Thank you.
Time for any questions? So you're using this causal terminology to provide this provide these justifications for decisions, and I think it's a very interesting idea. I just want to point out, so you're taking a trained system as a mechanistic system and then causally analyzing it, which makes sense, and it also makes sense because proper counterfactual. Only afterwards, when you tell people, there's still a difference. For instance, if it's about a loan, if you tell them you didn't get the loan because your salary was too low, people can imagine, yeah, there's a causal link between me not having enough money and then later on not being able to repay the loan. But other features might come up. If you tell them you didn't get the loan because you live in the wrong area, then you look at the system as a mechanistic causal system that's sort of on the same level, but for people it feels different because in that case there's no causal link between the actual feature in the world and the outcome.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We make this distinction very, very clear in the paper that we're not talking about causality in terms of we don't claim to have a causal model of the world and explain the world as it is. We actually avoid that because that's something that probably can't be done at the moment and probably need different techniques to do that in the first place. We make it very clear that we only talk causality in the sense of if I change something that the classifier will change. This is like the only causality thing that we make. We don't talk about the actual. We try not to explain the world as it is. We just tell you what happened in that particular decision, and we make it very, very clear that we're not touching that. But what you say is very important because philosophers would say what you say. Counterfactual explanation would actually help you or should help you to understand the world as it is, but that's not something that we claim. It's just we compare what philosophers think about counterfactual explanation and compare it to what counterfactual means from a tech perspective and show where it overlaps and where it doesn't.
So I was wondering that with your loan example, is in the days before machine learning, I would imagine that the bank has some little internal booklets where it says, well, these are the rules by which we give loans.
Yeah.
Income has to be such, blah, blah, blah. And then I could imagine that that little document would actually be under some legal scrutiny, also that the bank was forced to sort of make sure that it has some rules. And it seems that now there is much less openness about this. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, very, very good point. So I do understand that because it leads back to the question, why do we expect more of algorithms than we expect of humans? And if we already have regulation, why do we need more regulation? And I think it's fair to say that there are some things that will apply to loan decisions, for example, discrimination rules and all of that. But not all jurisdictions would actually require you to explain the reasons why you didn't get a loan, right? But the interesting thing is that with the new framework, loan decisions might be something that actually has significant effects, where you might have more rights than you would have if a human was making the decision. So that's the first thing. So for example, in the US, there's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That means if an adversarial decision is being made about you, you should be allowed to know about the reasons. This is not true for all jurisdictions. You don't have that. So it might just be that somebody tells you, well, you didn't get the loan, period. There's no obligation to explain to you why you made a certain decisions. Because in general, not just in loan decisions, but in general, we give the private sector, especially the private sector, private autonomy. So the freedom to have a contract with whomever they want to. Of course, there are limitations like anti-discrimination laws, but actually you don't need to explain who you conduct business with. And I guess it's changing a bit because I can see that with the rise of algorithms, for whatever reason, sometimes we expect more transparency than we expected of humans.
We're getting less. We're getting less because that little booklet that said, that was...
If you have that booklet, but if you just have internally that booklet, that's fine for you. It doesn't mean you have to tell the loan applicant about that booklet. You can have like an internal structure, business decision under what the thresholds are when you give out loans, but you don't need to make it public to everybody. So under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, you would need to tell the reasons why I don't give somebody a loan. So it depends on the legal regime in general. And with the new framework, you're actually going to be able to contest the decision. Usually you wouldn't be able to contest a loan decision. So that's more protection in that regard. Unless you have a reason to say, well, I think this was discriminatory or something like that. But you need to have like an indication of why this was discriminatory.
So there's a lot of hands, so I'm trying to have everybody in the right order.
So I like the intuition for the counterfactual explanations. However, there's a number of issues that come up. For example, when you look at most of our machine learning models, the set of natural inputs, the plausible ones, are a very small manifold within the larger set of possible inputs. And also the decision boundary tends to also include many inputs that are not in the plausible set. So when you try to do the counterfactual mechanism that you were describing, it's very plausible that you're going to say, you would have gotten this decision if only, and then express a completely irrational point in that space.
Yeah.
Also, you mentioned using, I think, the L1 norm, which is very sensitive to exactly how you've chosen to encode your features. So if you're talking about salary in euros versus thousands of euros versus millions of euros, the relative importance of that in your L1 weight is going to vary wildly. So like, you might imagine that a desirable feature of an explanation system is like that kind of scaling or feature representation shouldn't affect the explanations that the system is producing, that the mechanisms you're suggesting definitely don't have that feature. I think it's kind of thinking through some of those things that lead people to wonder whether it's plausible to actually build an explanation mechanism in this way.
Yeah, I get that part. It's a very good point. It's a very important point. I guess we use the phrase possible worlds, which doesn't mean it has to be a sensible or make sense world, if that makes sense, right? I guess this is something that we want to do in future research, because like possible only refers to what's possible under the current decision model, and possible, like, is it human possible? You could get like a counterfactual that tells you if you have been 1.5 lives black, you would have gotten the loan. And that's very nonsensical. Even though it's correct, it's very nonsensical. It's not possible to be just one shade whiter or you know, that's something. So you would need to take this into consideration when you actually define your distance metrics, which is very important. And the other thing is that's separate from the technical problem is what is possible from the perspective of the human being, right? And this is also something we want to do in future work, because I could tell you, yeah, you would have gotten the loan if you were like 1 inch shorter. But you're probably going to be very pissed if I tell you that, and for good reasons. So there's future work to be done to actually come up what is possible from the perspective of an individual, and what would actually enable them to change something that they are able to change, rather than saying, well, the algorithm said so. So there are two different things, and that's something that we want to explore further.
Describing what you just described as black box, I feel this is some of the features of black box where you're now really carefully looking into what the mechanisms of the system are.
You gave a great roundup, Sandra, of the implications of the GDPR. The principle of minimality is bracing, I guess, for some people. Particularly, I'm thinking of Genomics England, where the purpose of collecting genetic data and phenotype data is actually to collect maximal information, because it's an exploratory work. So what will happen to Genomics England? Are they going to get fined 5% return?
No, don't worry about that. So again, I get the general idea that data minimization doesn't really make sense for most big data applications, but I rest assured that the framework thought about that, because there are exemptions, for example, for research purposes. So a lot of the very strict obligations that you would have for just commercial purposes are much more lenient when it comes to research. So anything that has to do with research, statistical purposes, stuff like that, you have a much more agile model. So for example, with consent, right? Usually consent would only be valuable or valid if I consent to a specific purpose which can be very problematic if you're doing medical research, because you might find something and you can use the data for something else. And for example, for research, there will be something like broad consent, which would be much better. And most of those things, when it comes to research, there are reasonable exemptions that make it easier. So that's something that has been taken into consideration, which is good.
So thanks for
Just one second. I'm not going to cut the discussion short. So I'm trying to have everybody. If we take 5 minutes out of the poster, that's fine. Okay. I know there is a lot of hands, and I'll try to keep the order guys. Okay.
First of all, thanks for this super insightful talk. I hope you'll share the slides with us. I learned so much. It was great. So my one comment is I'm always worried that researchers kind of give companies an easy way to satisfy some requirement by saying this is an explanation, or this is fair, or this is interpretable. Wouldn't it make sense? So we've heard some of the comments. Modern machine learning methods have generally small L1 margins, so there are generally many ways to flip the classifier and cross the decision boundary. So that's not much of an ask, right? The company could always say, yeah, you got rejected because your income was too low, right? So aren't you worried that you're putting the bar a little bit too low on what you call an explanation? And shouldn't us researchers give them a hard time by saying this is not actually a good explanation? Listen to Bernhard and say, we actually want the full causal explanation here, and we're not going to give you this easy way to get around it.
Yeah, this is a very, very good point. And I don't want to say that I think counterfactuals are better than interpretability. I'm absolutely not saying that. Absolutely not. I think what we wanted to do with the paper is just to show legislators that explanations are not impossible, and that we should pursue that and just give them something, some indication there is something you can do. I fully agree with you that interpretability and actually the idea of understanding the full causality is something that is very important, not just for debugging a system, but also for justice in general, for democracy, I think. So I'm not saying do this and forget the rest. I just wanted to give some indication that getting away from, this is all very hard to do, technical. Just move on, and we'll do the black box thing because we can't do it. So that's something different. And I also think in terms of understanding the causal model, it might be very interesting for an individual to know that too. But probably understanding everything in the system is not the most important thing if you apply for a loan. It's very important for a regulator to understand that the system is actually working as intended. It's important for the companies to know that. It's very important to make sure that you don't pose too many risks to human rights in general. This is where we need to pursue that. In addition to that, you can give counterfactuals, but this is not a binary thing by no means whatsoever. I fully agree with you.
So you mentioned at some point that if you have humans involved in decision, that's an exception to many of the things that you said. And it's only applies to fully automated.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what that means? And the example that I have in mind is, let's say 90% of the cases are handled automatically, and 10% of the cases are looked at by an expert.
Yeah.
Would that be considered a mixed use, or would that be an automated use?
Yeah, super interesting question. So it's a bit tricky because during the drafting of the framework, the European Parliament proposed the phrase, you should get all your rights if the decision-making process is solely or predominantly automated. So if it had been predominantly, I guess some work of human and tandem action would actually still be seen as automated. They took that out and only made it solely automated, which to me means the final decision has to be made by an algorithm, and there is no human involvement within that system. The Article 29 Working Party said, well, it's still a solely automated decision if you just have human involvement as a token gesture or fabricate human involvement. So if I just have a person sitting there that is looking over the code but does not have the power to overrule the decision or actually give meaningful impact on how the decision is being made, it's still a solely automated decision. So they wanted to make sure that you can't avoid that. However, in a lot of things, this would still be not good enough. If you think about job applications, for example, if you have, let's say, 3,000 people apply for your job and you have an algorithm that ranks them, That's an automated decision. But the human decides who to invite. That makes it not solely automated anymore. So a solely automated thing would be the final decision is made by an algorithm, and the human has no intention or no capability of overturning them, no competence to overturn them. So it could be a mixture, and as soon as it's the mixture between humans and algorithms, it's not solely automated anymore. And all this is not relevant. I shouldn't be saying that, but if you have like a system where it's in tandem, you don't have to worry about GDPR that much anyway.
So almost everything you said involved the use of personal data, and I wanted some sort of your insights on, well, what is the definition of personal data? Is there a legal definition? Is there guidance on what personal data is? Especially in a world where people are putting sensors on all sorts of devices, some of which could be considered personal, some of which might not be.
This is an excellent question. There is like a joke in the data protection law community. If you want to define personal data, you're going to go mad at some point. Because it's expanding and we don't have a clear definition. So what the law actually says is personal data means any personal information that could be that identifies a human or is indirectly or directly identifying a human. That's the formal definition. It doesn't mean anything because you can't work with that. The Article 29 Working Party issued guidelines on what they consider personal data, and that's very broad. So they say any information that relates to a human being and that says something about them. And relating to is categorized in 3 steps. First, it's about the content. So it's actual information about you. It's your name, your email address, your IP address, something like that. Or the information has the purpose to identify you. That means by some combination of other data that is not considered your personal data, it makes an evaluation about you. As soon as you do that, it becomes personal data. And the third one, that's the most tricky one, even if the first 2 ones don't kick in. So it's not about you, and it's not the purpose is not to know something about you, but it has an impact on you. It could also be seen as personal data. So there's like this joke, there's no such thing as unpersonal data anymore, because you can always make a connection and say, well, actually it affects me in some significant way, or in some way. So I guess pretty much everything can be argued to be personal data. And it could also change, because something that is collected where you think this has no connection to a human being could become personal data 3 years down the road, because all of a sudden you combine it with something and then it changes. At the same time, if you know something and I don't know something, the same data is personal data for you but not personal data for me. So as I said, you're going to go crazy to find a coherent definition about that. So I guess when in doubt, probably say it's personal data.
Hi, I just wanted to ask more about the medical research. So you just mentioned that research in general will be treated differently.
Yeah.
But with healthcare data, things are extremely difficult, because all the guidelines, not too much the right of explanation of, because by the time you get there, you already know how everything works and is tested. So that's actually the easier part. But the thing that seems to me extremely difficult to handle is the actual guidelines. For example, in order to make progress by applying machine learning algorithms to medical data, we need to have historical data. Right? Data has been there for years, no one knew what it was for, but now it's useful. Because, for example, all the models that Shakir was presenting and all the questions that he had opened can be answered with data that has been stored in the past, and we didn't know what to do with it. And also, once we've done all this research, even if it is flexible, once, let's say, we go to the clinic, we are able to do it, we still have to collect data there. It's kind of an unknown. So it's like a vicious, almost like a circle that we can't get out using this type of guidelines. So my question is there any sort of different views of the problem in general of the regulations in order to accommodate the progress in medical data using machine learning. Because also personal data, to me, the most ultimate personal data is our DNA. And today we can read our DNA extremely well. We can tell everything from the DNA, and with the epigenetics you can even tell where you live, what you eat, how you run your day, and everything. So it is very difficult to see any progress from this point of view using this type of guideline in this framework.
Yeah, I get that a lot, and I think probably people in healthcare or in the medical profession are the people that hate data protection lawyers the most. And I do understand that, because they say, like, yeah, we actually want to save people's life and you forced me to fill that consent form. I get that. I get that there are a lot of restrictions there that are very much a hindrance when it comes to medical research. The only thing I can say is that what the framework does, and I think that's good, because especially when you're dealing with medical data, you're going to have higher obligation to preserve a certain data protection standard. So that's more about cybersecurity, making sure that the data is not accessed by anybody who shouldn't be authorized to do that, pseudonymize it, encrypt it, stuff like that. Don't share it with somebody outside the organization and stuff, which I think is sensible, and I think most medical professions would agree with that. When it comes to all the nuisance of, okay, you have to explain everything, you have to seek consent first. I mean, there are stuff in there you can, I have the right to delete my data, so I could actually go to you and say, well, I don't want you to use my personal data anymore, right? And that could be a very big problem. But with a lot of those things, there's actually, there will be a counterbalancing thing. So if I, for example, exercise my right to deletion, this will be counterbalanced of whether or not the withdrawal of my consent or my objection to the processing will completely ruin your study. So there are cases where your interest will overrule mine if I'm the data subject. And there's a lot of balancing in there as well, where the framework tries to be more, more helpful for medical research, because that's something that's in the public interest as well.
What about the storage limitations you mentioned, right? So let's say, okay, I have to delete it.
Yeah.
And today, without sharing, nothing works. So we share data because it's the only source.
Yeah. So as I said, you could actually, before you start, just ask for broad consent. That means that you actually don't only use that data for a specific purpose, but I'm giving you permission to use my DNA for a broad variety of purposes. So you wouldn't need to come back to me and ask me again. So that's one idea to do that.
I just wanted to bounce back on Andrew's question about this genome data. You said research versus commercial. Because now, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know these definitions, but given that so much research now is done in private labs, so what's commercial?
This is a fantastic question. I wanted to say that before, but I forgot. This is very, very important. Traditionally, you would think of research of something that has been done by universities. This was also something, traditionally, this was also something that was the intention, but they watered down the wording in the GDPR so much that research doesn't necessarily mean linked to university. So if you're a good lawyer, you could argue that Microsoft Research or DeepMind or Google is also doing research, which you can make an argument for. If they are researchers, that in that sense, they would get the exemptions too that I just mentioned. I've raised this because to a certain extent it makes sense. To a certain extent I think it's a big loophole. Because if you think about university research, what usually happens, you have ethics clearance, right? You have a project, you send the project in, there's an ethics review, something comes back, they explain to you how to improve that. This is often done externally. The journal won't publish it if you don't go for that. This is for research being done in universities. As a private entity, you don't have that. So is it fair that somebody gets the same exemption without having to adhere to the same ethical standards? And I actually think no. So I think actually if you do research that can be considered research as in the traditional sense, and you do it in a company, you should be adhering to the same ethical stance as universities. But it's a good point, it's a loophole. I shouldn't say that, right? But yeah.
Imagine we train a model on a personal or private data. Does the parameters of that model count as personal data or private data?
Sorry, one more time?
Imagine we train a neural network or any model on your personal data. Does the parameters, like weight parameters, count as personal data?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's screaming debate in the legal community of when something is personal data and whether or not processing makes it something different. So there's a very strong discussion in the IP community at the moment. Let's say if you train an algorithm based on personal data, but you're creating something that is creative and novel, shouldn't it be protected by intellectual property rights? And therefore, you can trump the personal data rights. It's undecided. There's a screaming debate around that. And you can make arguments for both sides. Same comes true for the output. Some say the output is personal data because you use personal data to get there. Others say, well, actually, it should reside with the company because it's a trade secret or intellectual property right. Screaming debate, no definition yet.
Can I take this to the extreme? So one of the classifiers that's pretty hard to beat is nearest neighbor. So if I take personal data and store it and then just classify with K nearest neighbor, I'm still making errors in prediction, but I practically stored personal identifiable data. How can that not be a violation?
Sorry, one more time?
So one of the classifiers that's not in your network stores the data.
Yeah.
And then basically a prediction plan works out what's the class of the nearest example, or the K nearest and takes the majority.
Yeah.
No, it's K nearest neighbor. So that one practically stores the data. But it's a prediction algorithm.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's not personal data anymore. Some say it's not, but I don't believe that's actually true. It just what will change, it's probably still personal data, but your rights that you have around that personal data will be limited. So for example, it's still personal data, but I can't delete it. That could happen because it would defeat the business purpose. There's an ongoing discussion around that as well. And there's, yeah, as I said, it's privacy lawyers versus IP lawyers, and they scream a lot.
I'm curious how technologies like differential privacy interact with that, where you can actually start making provable guarantees about how little data about an individual are in the aggregate.
Yeah, so that's something that I have been talking to a couple of regulators around that issue as well, which they didn't know that thing existed in the first place. But yes, I guess this is something that would be helpful, but still, the problem remains if you combine that with other data, you're still going to be able to make assumptions and predictions about an individual. And as soon as you can do that, you still don't get rid of the privacy rights and the privacy guarantees, if that makes sense.
I mean, the technical definition of differential privacy also limits your ability to combine with other data.
Yeah, but you're still going to have, this is the other topic that the privacy lawyers at the moment discuss of whether there should be something like group privacy. Because it's probably not just about singling out the individuals, but knowing something about a group that you belong to. And this could, there's discussion of whether privacy should only be about the individual, or if there is a bigger indication for the group that you have been assembled with. And then that's still a problem.
Thanks, Sandra, again.